A while back, I met a pastor who ministers in the Florida Keys, and I have been thinking of him after the Hurricane Irma came through. But I met this pastor who ministers in the Florida Keys, and he and his friend are starting this small house church. And when he's not ministering, or maybe as he's ministering, his kind of day-to-day job, what puts food on the table, is that he is a sound tech. And in the Florida Keys, there's all these vacationers. There are people that come down there and spend, some winter months. And so there's lots of restaurants and bars and venues where music is played. And he helps to set up the sound for musicians who are coming into these places. He's the guy that's back there at the controls, adjusting the knobs and plugging in the cables. And he said that what he does is always talk to the musicians ahead of time. He says he's different than some other sound techs who are in the Keys. He talks to the musicians ahead of time, and he says, look, I'm not going to leave until you are confident that it's going to be perfect. I'm going to make your music sound good. I'm going to make you sound good. I'm going to make it sound good, and then when you're comfortable, I'm going to leave. And he gets them all set up. He makes it sound good. And he has, it's kind of interesting, this gentleman has one of those Christian fish. You ever seen those, like on a car or something? He's got a Christian fish tattooed on his wrist. This works for him. He says that when he goes and shakes the hand of the musicians, sometimes they'll see that Christian fish. And that is this entree, this bridge into their lives, and that gives him a chance to share who he is, what his faith is, what he's doing in the Keys, and in some ways, why it is that he wants to make their music sound good, why he's going to do his best. And I think of this because I think it's a little bit like what Jesus is doing with these 70 or 72. He sends them out to proclaim peace, to work on behalf of their communities, and to connect with people of peace. And Jesus, I think, is doing something like that. They're getting involved in the life of their neighbors, in the life of their community, and they're proclaiming the gospel through those relationships that they're able to build through these connections. Now, last week we looked at how Jesus sent out the 12 disciples, and this week we see Jesus sends out the 70 or the 72 there to proclaim peace, make connections, work for the good of the community, find people of peace. Jesus sends them out. Jesus himself is on mission. He is sent, right? We see him living this out in his own life. And here, it's the 70 or 72, and so I don't know what your Bible says. Mine says 72 and has a footnote for 70. And it's really interesting because we don't know how many there were. Were there 70 or were there 72? Because some of our oldest Greek manuscripts say 70, and some of the oldest Greek manuscripts say 72, and you can't know for sure. And it turns out that both numbers are highly symbolic. So go back to the book of Numbers if you want to. You can do this at home. Book of Numbers, chapter 11. Moses takes 70 elders of Israel, and they go out to the tent of meeting. And it's at the tent of meeting that they meet God. But back in camp, there are two more, Eldad and Medad, and they begin to prophesy. The Spirit of God falls upon them. So there are the 70 who meet God, and there are the two, back in Numbers 11, there are these two who are left behind who have this encounter with God. So 70 is significant, but 72 is also significant. So it's hard to know, but Jesus is doing something like that. He gets these 70 or 72, these people who are going to bring the message of God, are going to go out and meet God and prophesy, sort of like those folks in Numbers 12. And he sends them ahead to the villages that Jesus himself is going to visit. He sends them, but then he's going, right? He doesn't ever ask them to do something that he wouldn't do himself. And Jesus tells these folks that they're to expect a response. They need to ask the Lord of the harvest to send workers into the field. He says the harvest is great. I mean, there are people out there who are ready for the message that Jesus is giving them. And the problem is not going to be that there's no one who responds. The problem is going to be that there aren't enough workers. And Jesus instructs them to ask God for workers. Ask for those who are willing to be sent. Ask for those who can go out. And he says in verse 3, go. And just like the apostles before them, Jesus tells them, travel light. They're like lambs among wolves. They take no purse. They take no bag. They have no sandals. They're not to get hung up on the way. Travel light. They just got to get there. And Jesus is setting them up to depend on God's provision and hospitality. They're to stay in others' houses. They're to plug into networks of family relationships and friends. They eat what others offer them. And there's this reciprocity. They're building relationships. They receive as much as they give. They listen as much as they speak. And what they're speaking is peace. So verse 5, if you're following along, verse 5, Jesus says, when you enter a house, he gives them instruction on what to say. When you enter a house, first say, peace to this house. And if you think about the ancient greeting of the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, he's telling them when you go into a house, you say shalom, right? Peace. That's what they're doing. So shalom to you. God's peace be upon you and your house. Shalom. Peace to this house. And they welcome, if they welcome the one that Jesus has sent, they're also welcoming Jesus, and that shalom, peace, rests on their house. If they do not welcome the person, then Jesus says the peace rebounds back to them and who have proclaimed peace. Now this shalom peace is peace with God. It's peace with one another. This is peace breaking out within families and neighborhoods and communities. And Jesus says, when you enter a house, you say, shalom, peace to this house. And then in verse 9, he says that they're to preach that the kingdom of God is near to you. And both of these things are related because peace and the kingdom are all about relationships. And proclaiming the kingdom, proclaiming the good news is always going to be about relationships. And we saw this last week, right, when we looked at Jesus' charge to the apostles that sharing their faith is going to be about building relationships. And we see the same thing here with this second set of disciples that Jesus sends out. They're supposed to stay in one house, the same place. He doesn't tell them to move around. You could cover a lot of ground that way. But he tells them stay in one house. He says receive hospitality. You eat whatever is set before you. And you can't do either of those things, stay at somebody's house or eat what they give you, without getting to know the person. So you stay at someone's house and you talk. You join them for meals and you talk. And it's into these everyday sorts of human interactions that Jesus expects them to share their faith. It's all about relationships. So the disciples' evangelistic style is relational. Their proclamation, it's relational because the kingdom of God is relational. Shalom, peace, is relational. And they take time to build relationships, and then they share the good news of Jesus into those relationships. One of the ways I think that we do the ways that we build relationships and proclaim peace, is by working for the good of the community. We bless our communities. We're looking for the greater peace of the communities that we live in. So we're living this shalom life, right? Or at least that's the idea. Are you living that shalom life? We're living this shalom life, and then we do that in the community. It's a shalom life in the community. Peace to you. Peace to your family, peace to your house, peace to this community, this county, this nation. It's like that pastor down in the Keys who makes those musicians sound good. He relates to them. He is doing it for their good. He's trying to build them up. Peace to you. It's out of relationship then that he and us can share the message of the gospel. But that handshake with the fish on his arm, he's got to build credibility first. He's got to first be showing that he cares for them and that he wants them to succeed. And I think it's like that for us. If we want to share the good news of Jesus with people, then we actually have to care for those people. Right? We have to care that their lives be good. Peace to you, peace to your house, peace to this community. People don't care about the good news that we're carrying if we're not first showing that we care about them. Right? I remember one time there was this little apartment complex that was close to where we used to live, and we kind of just had our sights on this apartment complex. And we'd go over there and we'd talk people up and knock on doors and whatever, right? Like we just sort of adopted this apartment complex. And built some friendships there. And I remember the manager of the apartment complex came out early on in this, and he's like, okay, what are you selling, right? Who are you? What do you want with us? What do you want with our community? Are you here for our good? Or are you just trying to sell us something? We've got to care for the community. This is why Paul says in Galatians 6:10, so whenever you have an opportunity, let us work for the good of all, especially for those of the family of faith. Working for the good of all is what gives us the street cred to share the good news. What this means is that as a church, we aren't just focused on ourselves. We aren't just focused on our survival or our thriving. It wouldn't work anyway, right? If the community's fallen apart, then the church certainly isn't going to be thriving. What we look at is the good of the whole community. We serve in our community. We get involved in our schools, our civic organizations. We don't just worry about people's spiritual well-being. We care about their whole lives. I was talking to a pastor in a little town the other day, and I asked him how his congregation proclaims the hope of Christ in his community. And what he told me is that they really look for ways to connect with folks and to care for the common good. And here's one thing that they do. Each year, their town has this festival. It's kind of the community days. And after the festival, the town's maybe in a little bit rougher shape because so many people have come through town. And so after their festival, their church gets together on Sunday morning. They have breakfast. And then instead of worshiping in the sanctuary, they go out into the community and they pick up trash and they get the bleachers back where they're supposed to be, and they, tidy up the town so that on Monday morning when businesses open up and kids go back to school, everything is looking beautiful again. That's one thing that they do. They get out there and they make that town look good. And this is one of the things I think we do really well at West Zion. I think a lot of us have been involved in different ways in the community over the years. I think we've got a love for our communities kind of built into our DNA here at West Zion. I think about Come and See Sunday, which we're going to try again next Sunday, this celebration. It's kind of like that, right? It's this meal to show that we care for the community, an act of hospitality for the community. Hope each of us will think about a person or two that we can connect with to come and join us for worship and to share a fried chicken meal. It's our chance to build relationships. And the thing about these relationships is that they take time to develop. So look at what Jesus says in verse 7. He says, stay in that house, eating and drinking whatever they give you, for the worker deserves his wages. Do not move around from house to house. And compare 7 to verse 4. In verse 4, he says, do not take a purse or a bag or sandals, and do not greet anyone on the road. So if you look at verse 4, don't talk to anyone on the road, right? It's this single-minded urgency. Get there. You're sent. Don't get hung up. You have a mission. Don't talk to anyone on the road. And then verse 7, it's the other side of the coin. Don't move around from house to house. Take time to eat with people. Receive hospitality. So it's kind of, it's this go, 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 but then on the other hand, when they get there, slow down. Stay in the house. Take time with people. You see Jesus taking time with people in his own life, right? A blind man calls out to him from the side of the road. He stops and he talks to him and he heals him. A woman touches the fringe of his cloak as he's moving through a crowded marketplace. Jesus stops, talks to her. Jairus comes up to him. A centurion comes up to him. A Pharisee comes up to him. Jesus takes the time to stop and be with them and talk to them. Jesus has this urgent sense of mission. It's like verse 4, go, go, go. But then it's like verse 7 in his own life. He's also got this calm ability to be present with people. He's not rushed when he's with people. Right? It's kind of this tricky balance. We want to have a vivid sense that God is sending us out on mission, but at the same time, we also want to be willing to take time with people. We're there with people to listen, to be present, to care for them. And one of the reasons that I think that we can get a little bit nervous or uncomfortable about sharing our faith is that we think that we've got to approach complete strangers on the street and kind of hit them up for the gospel. But notice what Jesus does. I mean, he sends out his disciples and tells them to stay put. He specifically forbids them from moving around from house to house. They're to get to know people. They take time with people. They spend time with people. They listen to people. And I imagine these disciples kind of going out during the day, but then turning around and coming back and staying at the same home during the night. It gives them this chance to get to know people over the long term. And of course, verse 10 and 11, if they're not welcomed, Jesus gives them instruction on that too. He says, just move on. Jesus says, woe to those cities. He says it's going to be better for Sodom on the day of the Lord than for a city that rejects the message of Jesus. And that sounds kind of ominous, but on the other side of what Jesus is saying is that he doesn't want his people to hang around and make a pest of themselves. If someone isn't at a point in their lives to hear the gospel message, to share in the peace of God, then we just let them be who they are and we move on. There will be people who want to hear the good news, but not everyone, not every day. And Jesus says, don't get hung up on that, just move on. And moving on is really an act of humility because it is so easy to make everything about us, to think, well, they don't like me. They've rejected me. But Jesus gives his disciples sage advice. He says, just move on. If they reject you, move on. Leave it to God. God will take care of it. In this passage, it wasn't very long ago that Jesus was rejected. So back in chapter 9, Jesus and the apostles, they go through a Samaritan village. Remember this story? They go through a Samaritan village, and Jesus is rejected by that village, and they don't want to hear his message. And the disciples are so angry about this that they say, Lord, should we call down fire from heaven? They want revenge. Burn the house down. Burn these people up. Surely the Lord will hear us and teach these nasty Samaritans a lesson. But Jesus says in 9:55, he says, he turns and rebukes them, and they go on to another village. So Jesus is like, just let it go, folks. Just move on. Don't make it about you. And sometimes the message isn't going to click. Sometimes people just don't want to connect right then. I remember once when I was in seminary, I had this idea, and I'm not sure it was a good idea, but I had this idea to go to the waiting area where people were waiting for visitation time at the county jail, and they're kind of all sitting in this room waiting to get into the jail and see their friend or their family member. And I had this idea that I would go to the waiting room and just kind of go and talk to people and try to talk them up about the gospel. It's kind of naive, really. But, I was looking at this and I think, man, here's all these people. They're sitting there. And they're obviously people who have some needs. And I can talk to them about Jesus. And I remember I was talking to people and I kind of went around. I'm like introducing myself. And I tried to start up a conversation with this young guy. And he just looks at me and he goes, look, I didn't come here to make friends. Which honestly I get, right? He came there to visit whoever. He's just trying to visit somebody in jail. There's a little bit of stress going on. And here's this young white dude showing up and trying to chat with him about Jesus. He didn't come there to make friends. And sometimes I think it's going to just be like that in our lives, right? It's not going to be the right moment for us to share our faith or to connect with someone, and we don't want to see that as a failure. When we see it as a failure, we're subtly turning it back on us. We're making it all about us, and it's just not. And we have to have the humility to pick ourselves up, shake the dust off of our shoes, and just move on. Let people be who they are. We don't want to turn them into our projects. In verse 11, be sure of this, says Jesus, the kingdom of God is near. And here's the thing, when we have the humility to not make it all about us, and to trust people to make their own decisions, what we're really doing is entrusting them to God. And there's always the reality of God's judgment, but God's fundamental nature, his character, is grace. Always remember how God treated the city of Nineveh. God was so gracious with Nineveh. Jonah, the prophet of God, who went in to proclaim the message of mercy in Nineveh, you remember this because you just heard it. He got mad at God. He thought God was entirely too gracious. The long and the short of it is that when we share our faith, it's got to be into relationships. And this is why Jesus told them to go and find people of peace, find the person of peace in verse 6, or the man of peace, the woman of peace. And the person of peace is going to be someone who God has already been working on. Jesus says that no one comes to him except those that the Father has drawn. So God is already at work before we show up. The person of peace is someone who is receptive to the gospel, who's receptive to talking to us. Not everybody's going to be at that point. I remember when I was a student, I'm going to find the person of peace. A long time ago, I was this student, and we went to this craft fair in the big city, and I started up this conversation with this gentleman, and in short order, it came out that I was studying the New Testament and whatever, and he just let loose with a total tirade of why he hates religion in every form. He's like, I hate Islam, I hate Buddhism, I hate Christianity. He just hated everything about it. And what you want to do in that situation is say, okay, thank you, and move on. But I could not resist. And I was like, but Christianity is different, and Jesus is different. And I was like trying to inject the gospel into this conversation, which only got louder and more heated. And finally, I just had to back away, right? But that is not the person of peace, right? We won't be able to argue someone into the gospel, especially if they come from a place of anger or hurt or something like that. You just have to let people be who they are. That's not the moment where you try to share your faith. Just bless them and move on. So we look for the person of peace. The person of the peace is someone who is open to the gospel. We're going to meet these people when we're connecting in the community. God's been at work in that person's life, and we show up and become a part of what God is doing. So in our context, when we're thinking about Come and See Sunday, here is the question. I want to leave this question with you for this week. Who's your person of peace? Who's someone in your life that you've been connecting to, that you have a relationship with? Who is the person of peace for you? So you can think about this week, or think about it right now. Who's your person of peace? It's someone that's open to the gospel, a person that is open to connecting to you, someone that you might invite to come and join us for Come and See Sunday. Don't forget to tell them about the fried chicken. Who's your person of peace? Bring them along with you, because look, Jesus is sending us. Jesus is drawing people in, so let's share that gospel invitation. Make it sound good. Amen.